Allow me to welcome you to the first lecture of the year at the Wood Institute. It gives me great pleasure to welcome my esteemed colleague, Dr. Carlo Ceretti, who last year joined the Departments of Classics and Religions at the University of California, Irvine, as the inaugural Ferdowsi Chair in Zoroastrian Studies, thus immensely enriching the faculty working on ancient Iran, both at UCI and in Southland. Prior to his move to California, Dr. Ceretti was professor of Iranian philology, religions, and history at the Sapienza University of Rome. I first met Professor Ceretti as a young graduate student. He was slightly older, while working with the late David Neil Mackenzie at the Seminar für Iranistik in Göttingen, whereto he would occasionally venture, coming from Rome, to discuss his doctoral dissertation with the great but stern Mackenzie, whose generous but challenging personality was the source of much commiseration between us. I have obviously ever since followed his brilliant scholarship, which shall briefly be introduced here. Dr. Ceretti's work is very versatile and encompasses both archaeological fieldwork and well-researched scholarly publications. The principal axes of his scholarship concern the history of Zoroastrianism as an ancient and late antique phenomenon, and the literary traditions that pertain to it. That is both the Avestan sources and the Middle Persian exegetical Zoroastrian traditions, the so-called Pahlavi literature. His philological expertise covers other Middle Iranian corpora as well, including Manichaean texts, as well as Sasanian epigraphic traditions, whereon he has been focusing more recently. His first monograph is an excellent critical edition and translation of the important Middle Persian treatise, apocalyptic treatise, called Zande Wahman Yasn, which represents a unique text within the corpus of late antique Zoroastrian scriptures. The edition, which is complemented with judicious text critical commentaries on the religious context of the treatise, showcased Dr. Carlo Ceretti's interpretative skills as a consummate philologist and keen-minded historian of Zoroastrianism. His second monograph, La Literatura Pahlavi, the most complete survey of Zoroastrian Middle Persian scriptures today, further underlines his remarkable intellectual versatility by illustrating his command of methodological departures in literary criticism and their skillful application to an arcane late antique corpus, yielding original perspectives. If I'm not mistaken, this treatise was recently translated also in Persian, correct? That, of course, further underlines its status as a reference book. Among Dr. Ceretti's most current projects, one ought to mention his work on the royal inscriptions of the Sasanian King Narse at Paykuli in Iraqi Kurdistan, which dates back to the late 3rd and early 4th century of the Common Era. The Paykuli is one of the two most important royal inscriptions of late antique Iran, in importance only comparable to the much earlier res gestae of the Roman princeps Augustus. Dr. Ceretti is preparing a much anticipated new critical edition of the Paykuli inscription. I, for one, realizing all too well that I belong to a very small minority, count the days for it to come to fruition. I've been counting this for the last 20 years. For this inscription, Dr. Ceretti has been able, in the wake of countless campaigns in Iraqi Kurdistan over the past decades, to locate and secure numerous written blocks of the Middle Persian and Parthian versions of the inscription, deemed last, and shall attempt at restituting more closely the text of this significant world patrimony. He's also to be credited for rendering invaluable service to the preservation of the cultural patrimony of the wider Iranian world, for being the driving force behind the work of the Italian archaeological mission to Iraqi Kurdistan, that under his leadership has done much to preserve the Paykuli monument, among others by erecting a dedicated wing at the Soleimani Archaeological Museum, wherein all extant blocks of the Paykuli inscription are preserved and are displayed. So thank you so much. Equally ambitious is another project of Dr. Chartres, which is a consequential and much needed study of the Zoroastrian writing tradition, a study in the ontological difference of the sacred spoken word in contrast to writing, which inevitably took place in Sasanian Iran and displayed the sacrality of orality in rite, performance, and transmission within Zoroastrian religious thought. One of the most impressive and fascinating features of Dr. Chartres' personality is his life experience as a trusted and enterprising scholar who, over the course of a brilliant academic career, has established numerous networks, vast intellectual connections, both in Europe, Northern America, and also in Iraqi Kurdistan. While he's still active with the research cells he has single-handedly established. And lastly, Iran, where he acted as the Italian cultural attaché for many years, together with his lovely wife, Tiziana, and enjoys an excellent reputation as a reliable and dedicated interlocutor. His talk today focuses on a most essential, and I may add, thorny issue related to the genesis of Persian, especially during the transitional period from Middle to New Persian. There are indeed some temporal lacunae we observe during the transitional period from the Sasanian age to the early Islamic period, before encountering the latest iteration of Persian in its new garb, in New Persian garb. Temporal lacunae that have always been a matter of informed scholarly debate among specialists. More recently, however, other voices, less capable voices, from neighboring disciplines, voices regretfully not commanding the diachrony of Iranian languages nor the corporate grace, have emerged, generously ascribing a patois status to New Persian, or deeming it a creole created by Abbasid colons, somehow detached from the millennia-old evolution of the Persian language. Whereas the field ought to welcome and salute new impulses to inform this inquiry, it is, of course, a great boon to review the evidence in the company of a seasoned scholar who, like few others, commands over the diachrony and is qualified to pass judgment on this most intriguing issue. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chartres.
So, what is it that I may say after such an introduction? Except that for once, smoking has proved into a very good investment, because a lot of the time we spent together in Göttingen was smoking cigarettes outside Professor Mackenzie's seminar, because he would not allow anyone, except Professor Shayegan, to enter, oh well, not exactly with a permission, to enter with a cigarette. So thank you very much, Professor Shayegan. It is true, it's a friendship that lasts since many decades, and this is the only justification for all the good words you have heard about me from Rahim Shayegan. So first of all, I wish to thank you all for coming here, and I wish to thank all those working at the center and researching here for taking the time to listen to the few things I have to say. Today I will present and discuss a number of inscriptions and documents in Middle Persian, aiming at highlighting the contribution of primary sources, specifically coeval written sources, to the reconstruction of the spread of Persian to a vast Iranian-speaking area during the long Middle Iranian millennium. I will emphasize the gradual extension of the Persian-speaking world in the Sasanian period, when the presence of a centralized state, or to say it better, of a state that grew more and more centralized with the passing of centuries, led to a common language throughout the empire, a language that was the tongue of the administration, a language that was the language of culture and religion, and a language that was the language of the army. I will not discuss, at least not extensively, inscriptions directly related to royal will, since this would require a lecture of its own, and our host here today has done this, especially for the Narse inscription, in great detail. Moreover, my aim is to show that by late Sasanian times, literacy was not limited to the elite. Rather, Middle Persian was written and probably spoken by many, and it had already spread to the entire Sasanian Empire. Today's talk represents to some extent an ideal dialogue with two authors who recently wrote about the compass of Persian literature in the Sasanian period and on the genesis of New Persian. Kevin van Bladel has shown that secondary sources attest to the existence of a thriving Persian literature already in the Sasanian period. And I should add that the longer Sasanian inscriptions contained, as Professor Shayegan has just said, examples of literary narrations, such being the victorious ride against the Romans described by Chabot I in his Kabe Zardosht inscriptions and echoed in Kerdir's inscriptions, as well as the literary dialogue between Narse and his supporters reported by the king himself in his Paikuli text. So basically, we have reflection of this literature already at the beginning of the Sasanian era, and whether that was a written literature, an oral literature, I am not much of an oralist myself, remains to be seen. Etienne de Lavassière, in a talk that was broadcasted and in an article that is forthcoming in Iran, to which I could read thanks to the kindness of its author, correctly addressed the role played by the army in the birth of Persian. However, I believe that this took place already in the Sasanian period, to continue probably after the rise of Islam. But to say that Marv or anywhere else was the epicenter is, from my point of view, a bit too far-fetched. Moreover, I believe that this process was fostered by specific social classes. First of all, those of the Sasanian dibirs and other members of the administration. When I say dibir, I don't mean only the scribe in itself, but all those that had to do with the daftar, with the office. Not least the magi. That is a class of people who ran Sasanian government, which was able to reinvent itself after the Arab onslaught, and who would later constitute the administrative skeleton of many state entities in the Islamic period. Not only bureaucracy, but also, of course, the clergy, and we will see why, and the military. Rika Rieselen and Edward Khoursoudian have recently discussed the role played by the dibir in a paper that builds on earlier works by Ahmad Tafazoli, all quoted here, and I deem Tafazoli's work to be foundational. I will not talk anymore about this. Any who may be interested can read Riesel and Khoursoudian's paper and then Tafazoli. Moreover, one cannot discuss the development of Persian in the early Islamic period without mentioning the passage attributed to Ibn al-Mughaffa, who died in 759, and found, among others, in Ibn al-Nadim's Firhist. We are at the end of the 10th century. It has been discussed by many, primarily Gilbert Lazare, and I will not do it again here. However, I want to draw your attention to the fact that this passage is followed by a long one listing several different forms of writing in Iran, not all easy to be identified. I wonder, but would be more than hesitant to write it down, whether the difference between Parsi and Dari may not be more due to a form of diglossia rather than to a true dialectal difference. And I mean, I am a witness of how difficult it is, especially in my case for a foreigner, to understand two members of the clergy speaking among themselves in com, since they really speak a different register of language. And so the language spoken by scholars and priests may have been different because based on a different technical jargon. One of the aims of today's talk is also to highlight a few documents that are less known and are endangered in present-day Iran. The first document that I wish to introduce today is the Aramaic inscription on Darius I's tomb at Nakhchurustan. A recent comprehensive discussion of this text is Fry's The Aramaic Inscription of Darius I, which was published in Iranic Antiqua 1982. The American scholar discusses line by line the claims made by Altheim in Geschichte Mittelasiens im Altertum, and as Fry writes, the inscription was discovered by Herzfeld in 1923, more than a century ago, and it was later studied by Altheim, as we have seen. But in March 1950, Walter Bruno Henning was invited to Iran, thanks to Hassan Taqizadeh, and could see the inscription. As it often happens, when a master writes something, then everyone believes this something to be true. In his epoch-making 1958 Mittel Iranisch, Henning briefly discusses this inscription, assigning it to the reign of Seleucus I or Seleucus II. We are in the basically in the 3rd century. Since he read, or he thought to read, the name Sluk in the inscription, he did not report a specific line, saying only, and I quote Fry's word, that it was before one's eyes in the inscription and stood alone with no following letters visible. That is, it must have been the name. To make a long story short, Fry thought that the inscription was an Old Persian inscription in Aramaic letters, generally dating to the 4th or early 3rd century BC, rather than the 5th century according to the form of the letters. Fry also tentatively assigned it to one of the late Achaemenid kings, either Artaxerxes II or Artaxerxes III. Professor Adriano Rossi, who did not yet write anything about the subject, but with whom I corresponded, had the opportunity to see the inscription in the late 90s and has shared his opinion with me. According to Rossi, Fry's interpretation makes a lot of sense, and his impressions of the rock autopsy partly square with what Rossi himself could see in the late 1990s, when a scaffolding was in place, which allowed him to go up to Darius's tomb, and also to witness the fact that the surface was extremely deteriorated. As a matter of fact, at the time, Rossi and Ismeo had started fundraising to document the inscription, but then, unfortunately, the plan just collapsed. According to both Fry and Rossi, the essential point is that there is no isolated Seluk, so no supposition can be based on the presence of this hypothetical name. Instead, the Achaemenid title, Shayathia Vazarka, appears in line 20 and is still legible today. Therefore, the one indisputable thing is the mention of a royal Achaemenid title in the inscription. However, contrary to Fry, Rossi believes that the inscription must be post-Achaemenid, since should it have been written by an Achaemenid king, albeit a late one, the title would not occur in line 20 out of 25, as we know from all royal designations occurring in inscriptions from the ancient Near East. Therefore, one of the hypotheses that Fry mentions only to discard them may indeed prove to be true. The text may be due to the will of a post-Achaemenid local ruler, possibly one belonging to the Frataraka dynasty, since no local chieftain could have had or would have had the authority to write on a royal tomb in Achaemenid times. Should this be the case, it would once more show, should there be any need of doing so, that the dynasty of Fars reconnected their line to the ancient emperors, and therefore this inscription would have been a conscious act of cultural appropriation. And this also reflects on what has happened with the Sasanians and so on. What would have been the language of the inscription? It might have been Aramaic with a significant number of Iranian loanwords, this being Rossi's favorite hypothesis. But on the other hand, and I would like this version better, we cannot exclude that it may represent the earliest attestation of an Iranian heterographic script, possibly disguising a very early form of Middle Persian. And this would, in fact, square in well with the so-called Arsacid Achaemenid program on which one may see the book written by Rahim Shayegan in 2011. From the linguistic perspective, this would work because the scholarly consensus, though not unchallenged, is that Persian began to lose its nominal flexion under the late Achaemenids. Therefore, a 3rd century date would allow for a text written in Middle Persian to exist. And should this be the case, and I would like it very much but cannot demonstrate it, today's narration would start from this very inscription. And this also somehow highlights the importance to document with modern techniques these inscriptions before it is lost. Is a, or it could be the missing link between the Achaemenids and, let's say, the Sasanians, or at least the dynasty of Fars. For the sake of comparison, I will briefly introduce a pointillé inscription published originally by Chervaux in 1997, which together with a similar inscription published by Sims Williams in 2021 represents the oldest known attestations of Middle Persian. The alphabet used by the author of the ownership inscription closely resembles that attested on the coins of Darayan II, who likely reigned around 50 BCE. From the point of view of their content and commissioning, these inscriptions still belong to local elite production and say little about the spread of Persian beyond Fars. However, they show that even dismissing the so-called Aramaic inscription at Naxxerostam, a pioneering writing tradition had developed in the core Persian-speaking region before the turn of the millennium. Now, the translation that you see on the screen is basically Octo Chervaux amended by Sims Williams, and the only thing I changed is I somehow would like Darayanagan to be a dynastic name. Much later are the Middle Persian and Parthian graffiti and dipinti dating to the 3rd century of the current era at Dura Europos. Dura was, as we all know, an important city and emporium founded under the Seleucids in 303 BCE, which flourished in the Parthian period and was finally razed by the Sasanian Shapur I in 256. It was a multicultural urban center that knew different dominations throughout its history. Therefore, it is no surprise that different religious cults are attested in the city. In the synagogue, we count 12 dipinti in ink written in Middle Persian, 3 Parthian graffiti, and 1 long Middle Persian graffito on the north jamb of the main door. A Parthian and 5 Middle Persian dipinti are found in the House of Frescoes, 2 Parthian graffiti were discovered in the Temple of Zeus, and so on. The only date is probably a Seleucid date. Month Adar at 11, on the 11th in the morning, which may be interpreted as March 221 or 212 of the current era, according to Henning. Other than this text, we have a dozen ostraca, all except one written in Parthian, and most importantly, 3 documents, 3 letters, 1 in Parthian and 2 in Middle Persian. One of the 2 in Middle Persian is a long letter written by a general to another slightly inferior in rank officer of the Sasanian army. Now, according to Franz Grenet, and you see the passage on the screen, the dipinti in the synagogue were all written between March 26 and April 20, 253 of the current era. Now, once again, the problem exactly we have with these documents a problem similar to the problem that we have with Seleucus inscriptions. They are kept in the Damascus Museum, which is at present, especially for Americans, very difficult to visit and to document. And as far as I know, they are not, let's say, in an exceptional state. The compresence of Parthian, the first one, this is a dipinto in the synagogue. This is an ostracon in Middle Persian, and this is a graffito in Parthian. The compresence of Parthian and Middle Persian documents at Dura Europos shows that in the 3rd century, the Sasanian army and all that came with it still used both languages. So the former, Parthian, may have been somewhat residual. Moreover, the high-quality dipinti written by scribes, dibir, witness to the emergence of an administrative class that wrote in Middle Persian. Most probably, these scribes were attached to the Sasanian army, proving that already in the 1st Sasanian century, armies and bureaucracy contributed to the gradual increase of the area of spoken, or at least written, Middle Persian. There are various hypotheses on why and who were the people who wrote in the synagogue and in other places. But to me, it seems that the easiest one is that they somehow came or were attached to the army. Interestingly, a similar development seems to have taken place at court when the family of the Vaharamids was in power in the second half of the 3rd century. Vaharam I was the first sovereign to use MP alone, Middle Persian alone, in his short inscription at Bishapur, later usurped by Narseh. A few years later, under Vaharam II, the high priest Kerdir had 4 inscriptions engraved in royal sites, and all these texts were written in Middle Persian alone. Though no positive evidence can be produced, in my opinion, it is reasonable to think that Kerdir used Middle Persian specifically because it was the church language, and therefore the only proper one for a Magu to use. This does not explain why Vaharam I used it alone. However, one shouldn't forget that the Bahramids were close allies of the Mazdian Church and sturdy supporters of Kirdir. It may not have been by chance that Narcé reverted to bilingualism in his Paikuli inscription, since he strove to prove the continuity with his father, Shabur I, denying de facto legitimacy to the Bahramids. Moreover, he may well not have been Kirdir's first choice for the throne, and the Magus's power may have been lessened under this king. I must say that it was reading Olivia Ramble's dissertation that this fact came to my somehow to my attention, that I noticed this fact. And Olivia Ramble has a different explanation, saying basically that Bahram wrote in Persian because he did not really need anymore to prove his legitimacy to foreigners writing in Greek or to the Parthian aristocracy writing in Parthian. But this would not explain then Narcé. Of course, Mazdian religious traditions have also used other languages, and the existence of a fossilized Sogdian Ashemvo points in this direction. But it should also be said that this happened not within the Sasanian Empire, but outside. Now, coming to a much later period, probably under one of the Khosrows, we have a couple of archaeological discoveries, both fire temples, that clearly show that the language used by pilgrims in Sasanian or early post-Sasanian fire temples was Middle Persian alone. And this was true in Kashan, as well as, I wrote down, in Mashhad, a bit to the south of Mashhad. I would like to continue to have permission to enter Iran and not to say that Imam Reza is basically a Mazdian fire temple, which would not make me the favorite of the present government. In recent years, Professor Meysam Labaf Khaniki's archaeological work on the site of Bazehur has brought to the light, among many other things, a considerable number of ink inscriptions in Pahlavi. Labaf Khaniki has conducted extensive field work in the area of Bazehur. This is an aerial photo by Meysam Labaf that we used in an earlier presentation on the subject. And he first investigated the area of the Chartak, then moving to the top of Koué Dokhtar, where the building complex known as Kaleye Dokhtar stands. Here, the ink inscriptions were found on the wall of the room leading to the central fire chamber. Now, Kaleye Dokhtar clearly was an important ritual complex, so we cannot be certain, we cannot say at this stage, or at least we cannot prove, that it was the site of Adur Burzenmir. So, Ali Ashraf Sadeghi has suggested that the seat of Adur Burzenmir might have been in the province of Bust, south of Nishapur, that is not too far from Bazehur. Whichever may be true, the presence of the heterogram Ba for Dar, used in Pahlavi literature to indicate the major fire temples, confirms that it must have been an important shrine. And these are the passages. The ink inscriptions are, at least in part, votive texts of pleas written by pilgrims and believers, that is, by commoners. showing that the day-to-day language in this area must, in late Sasanian times, must have been Persian, or at least the pilgrims knew enough Persian to write it. In 2021, Mohsen Javeri and his team started excavating a fire temple that had been discovered in 2010 in the ancient site of Vigol at the border between the counties of Kashan and the county of Aran and Bidgol in central Iran. And they published several articles on this, among which one in 2022 on the Sasanian Pahlavi inscription of the Vigol fire temple. The article reports 3 inscriptions. They discovered 6 inscriptions. 3 were published in this article. And as a matter of fact, it is an article that has among its authors also Dieter Weber. I don't think that Dieter Weber, there must have been some error in communication because the texts are not what the article says. I'm not sure about what they are, but at least the one in plaster should, in my opinion, repeats a sentence which is basically "o something pana," which I have tentatively tried to read either "o gugai pana," let's say protection or protector of the witness, or even better, except that the term is not attested, which makes a small problem for a linguist, or gunai, refuge for the sinner, which would, especially for a Catholic coming from Italy, makes very good sense in a shrine. Taken together with Kirdir's inscriptions, with the ones found at Vazehur, and with the role played by clerics in Sasanian administrations, these texts highlight not only the spread of Persian, but also the important role played by the Zoroastrian Church in this development. It spread also because it was the language of religion and culture. A third, by now very famous site, has been interpreted as a fire temple, possibly a shrine located inside a manor house manned by aristocrats that had moved to the area to guard the empire's eastern borders. The set of buildings found at Bandian has been convincingly interpreted by Rabat to be a ritual area centering on a fire temple. This interpretation was challenged by Gignoux in 2008, who believes it to be a luxurious manor that may possibly have belonged to a Marzban. I will not discuss the archaeological part. I'm not much of an expert of material culture, but I would like to highlight that Kanheri in 2014 said that it could have been a temple inside a larger estate, a dastgir. And there's a problem also in interpreting the term dastgir. Mehdi Rahbak's discovery also brought to the light a few Middle Persian inscriptions. The inscriptions are engraved in plaster in an alphabet that still preserves many characteristics of inscriptional Middle Persian. So letters touched one another, tending to a more cursive variant. On account of this and of wider historical and archaeological considerations, this text may be assigned to the 5th century. Rahbar goes one step farther. Following Bashash, which is a risky thing to do, he considers the monument to have been erected to celebrate the victory of Bahram V over the Hephthalites. So possibly to have been erected in 425. According to the same author, Bandian was pillaged and destroyed by the Eastern Huns in 484, and therefore the monument would have had a relatively short lifespan, less than 60 years. This monument witnesses to the fact that Persian was spoken and written in Khorasan already in the 5th century, earlier than Kavad's and Khosrow's sweeping administrative reforms. Were the people inhabiting Bandian part of a military elite sent by Perros to guard the eastern border? Secondary sources, such as Armenian historians, would support this possibility. But again, we are in no position to reach definitive solutions. Now, I have moved this monument down, not following the chronological order, because it represents a welcome link to texts that are due to the military presence of the Sasanians. One, and the most famous, is Darband. And what we know for certain is that the Derbent or Darband fortress and fortifications were built by the Sasanians to guard the Caspian shore, cutting the easiest path to cross the Caucasus, descending towards Albania, Armenia, and the Iranian plateau. 34, two only recently identified, short Middle Persian inscriptions dating to the 6th century were discovered over the years on the walls of the important fortified city of Darband in the Caucasus. The first to pay any attention to them was Prince Dimitri Cantemir, who headed Tsar Peter's I's field chancellery during the emperor's Persian campaigns in 1722-23. Only one of the inscriptions in Darband is dated, and the reading of the date is disputed. Should one follow Henning's suggestion to read 37 or 27, and considering the evidence of Islamic authors, one should assign them probably to the reign of Khosrow I, one of the few sovereigns to have reigned for at least 27 years. So dates in the regnal, so these days would also fit the regnal years of Kavad I, or less probably Khosrow II. I would tend to exclude Kavad I because these were, as we see in the text, they were carved by an Amargar. And an Amargar, as far as we know, it's not the only possibility, became a fixed administrative position with the reform. The Middle Persian papyri recovered in Egypt, mostly from the antique market, and today housed in many public and private collections around the world, the most important one belonging to the Austrian National Library, but unfortunately not housed at the Austrian National Libraries, are yet another proof of the synergic role played by the army and military administration in the spread of Persian as the language of the empire. I will not say anything more on the Veen and in general on the papyri, because our host and other friend have already been sufficiently annoyed by myself on the subject in another occasion. So it would seem too much. So now reaching a first set of conclusions. If we turn to looking at the distribution of Persian today, in general, in what was at one point the Kalamroy Zabane Farsi, the area of Persephone, as Fragner would have said, we can see that it matches the attestations of Middle Persian at its various stages. This is due to the fact that I am absolutely inept with computers, but stars are, let's say, late inscriptions, flags are documents, and I think red hearts are the royal inscriptions. So sorry for what I'm doing. It's not complete. For example, the one graffito in the Upper Indus is not there, nor is the text found in Japan, and so on, but it gives an idea. And if you restrict it to the Iranian plateau itself, you see that most inscriptions and most texts are in what one may call central Iran and Khorasan, around the Great Depression of the Dastelut, Daste Kevir, which again is exactly where Persian is spoken on the highlands today. The Kurdish Kurmanji blue up north in Khorasan derives from the Kurds having been moved there in Qajar times, and the same is true also for this green. Let's say Turkoman Turkish. So this is the first what happened until the end of the Sasanian period. Until the end of the Sasanian period, we have attestations of Persian on the whole of the plateau, at least. If I have a bit more time, I will indulge for a few minutes in what happened afterwards. At this stage, I would like to introduce a few inscribed objects or monuments that witness to the enduring prestige of Middle Persian in the early and also not so early Islamic centuries. Two important bilingual Middle Persian Arabic inscriptions are found still today on the tomb towers of Lajim and Radegan, respectively in today's Mazandaran and Golestan, roughly saying historical Tabaristan. These mausoleums were built upon the order of members of the princely Bavandid family, Ale Bavand, at the beginning of the 11th century. So the script used in the two inscriptions is somehow closer to the one used in Pahlavi books. Both are meant to be official documents, and the towers on which they are written were most probably used as tomb towers by members of noble families of Tabaristan. The style of writing used, and this, in my opinion, is very important, is substantially a Kufi Middle Persian. Now, what happened is that, again, Henning dismissed them, saying the alphabet is almost as unintelligible as cursive Middle Persian. But the phenomenon is completely different. Here, whoever wrote these inscriptions at the beginning of the 11th century, in the same years in which Ferdowsi was completing his Shahnameh, was able to deal with Middle Persian alphabet in a way, in an artistic and calligraphic way. So adapting it to the stylemes of the Kufic, which was the fashionable way for writing Arabic at the time. The language is substantially a form of New Persian, still written using the Pahlavi alphabet. And you will see at the end that it is wrong to talk about Middle and New Persian, at least in this period, at least in my opinion. In the latter inscription that is in Lajim, the only non-Iranian words are found in the name of the dedicatee, Al-Bulvaris Shariar ben Abbas ibn Shariar, while in the former we have the name of the prince, Abu Jafar Muhammad ibn Vandarin Bavand, and his honorific title, written Maula Amiri al-Mumenina, so in a different way in respect to the way in which it was translated on, for example, coins of Tabarestan. We also have the interesting use of the numeral tirist for 300, a word, a numeral that is attested in Manichaean Middle Persian as well as in New Persian, though rarely as far as I know, in New Persian. And then you also have the loan word tamam, which further prove that basically the text was written in a regional variant of a language that already contained enough Arabic, if we want to call it so, to be called New Persian. And this is Mille Radekan. I always show photos of Mille Radekan because I am in love with the place. It was the only place where I went every summer. As soon as Tiziana left Tehran, I got on the car and I went to Mille Radekan, so, because she would never come. Talking with Professor Dariai, he also drew my attention to the Samanid and Buid coins with the title Shahan Shah Huara Abzud. The King of Kings has increased the Huara, and which were minted respectively by Mansur ibn Nu in 356 and by the Buid Rukn al-Dawla in 351 Hijra. What is interesting, in my opinion, is not only the coins in themselves, the fact that they use basically a Sasanian, a restyled Sasanian coinage, but also that whoever prepared the dies for these coins was able to write, to edit Middle Persian, to change it, to hyper-correct it, but also to develop a form of ornate Middle Persian script. Again, we are in the 10th century. Pahlavi is still, to some extent, alive, but not as Middle Persian. It is alive as Persian, the language of the Iranians, or better said, the language of those who were not Arabs. This is the Quilon Copper Plate. They are signature of witnesses on a grant that is easily datable to the second half of the 9th century, since it is a grant that was granted by a king called Stanu Ravi Varma in southern India, in Kerala, who reigned from 844 to 870 of the current era. Now, this, the main corp of the inscription is written in Vateletu Tamil with a number of stylistic choices. We will not dwell on these, but it also presents 10 lines of Arabic written in the Kufic alphabet. I am no expert of the Kufic alphabet, but Roberta Junta, to whom I showed this inscription, told me that it looks like an Egyptian style. I have no idea whether this is true or not, but some of the names, like some of the names of the people, like Marzban, look more like Iranian names. Then we have 18 lines of cursive Pahlavi and 8 lines of Judeo-Persian. The Judeo-Persian carries the signatures of the Jewish community. The Pahlavi, curiously, carries the signatures of the Zoroastrians and of the Christians. What is interesting for us here is the fact that around the mid-9th century in India, a document attests the use side by side of Middle Persian and Jewish Persian, once more revealing the conservative character of the MP, of the Middle Persian writing system. which means that Judeo-Persian has already New Persian verbal forms. Pahlavi has middle, in commas, verbal forms. Again, this clearly means that whoever wrote these documents spoke New Persian, simply the graphical rendering was different. At the same time, this document also shows that Christian and Zoroastrian merchants that still had ties with the mainland, we are sure of this for the Christians, it is more than possible for the Zoroastrians, at least in my opinion, still used the old alphabet for their own living language. Now, all this works perfectly. Of course, since this cannot be the case, I will also show you two examples and try to explain them away that speak against this interpretation. And these are two related groups of texts that may attest to the fact that Parthian was still written in the Sasanian period. I must say, both groups are difficult to date, and most groups are due to a very local hand. Anyhow, these two very important sites are found in southern Khorasan, not far one from the other. Lakhmazar hosts numerous graffiti written in Parthian, Middle Persian, New Persian, and Arabic, as far as one may judge from the very bad publication, and bad not because of the quality of the people who did the research, Labaf Khaniki, Fazer, and Bashas, but bad because it was published immediately after the Iran-Iraq war, when it was difficult to have a good quality of print in Iran. On the contrary, the texts found at Kale Jangal, and this is one example, are all in Parthian. As a matter of fact, Kale Jangal and Lakhmazar both feature figurative and textual graffiti, which may point to their having one and the same group of writers. The one problem, again, Henning published these inscriptions, Kale Jangal, he said probably early Sasanian. Why is it early Sasanian? Because it contains the name of Ardashir, Gari Ardashir, the mountain of Ardashir, and therefore it must be after Ardashir, which is, let's say, a weak presupposition, I would say. But this set the trend. And so Rasul Bashas Khanzak identified in a recent and good article the name Vishtiwen at both sides. However, his interpretation of the inscriptions, the identification of the name Vishtiwen may be correct. However, his interpretation of the inscription as belonging to a group of Mazdakids that found refuge in this area of South Khorasan, known as Kohistan, to say the least, needs further proof. It would set the graffiti at the end of the Sasanian Empire, but I mean, whether it is defensible, and I must say, it very much reminds me of the Kaseya Sanjan and the fact that the Zoroastrians took refuge in a Kohistan, so this may have been in the back of Rasul Bashas Khanzak mind when he formulated it. A recent article by Parvaneh Pourshariati and Pouria Ali Moradi has reassessed the evidence, and the authors have done valuable work on the inscriptions, particularly by bringing together information often published in volumes that are not easily accessible, especially in the West. I must say, I think that Pouria Ali Moradi's reading, at least in one place, improves on Lifshit's reading. Nevertheless, some aspects of their paper demand further discussion, specifically the religious interpretation of the texts and symbols found at these sites, which according to Pourchariati and Ali Moradi's argument, should be assigned to an aristocratic Parthian household worshipping Mithra. I have discussed this in a chapter presenting graffiti in Western Iran. I will not discuss it again, but I think that the materiality of these inscriptions, especially the one in Lakhmazar, show that they are not an elite production. So I have, let me show you the different, this is the publication of Lakhmazar. So I have, let's say, reached the end of my presentation and will sort of speak out to illustrate what my conclusions are. I will start by a quote from the Encyclopedia Iranica, and this is the place where to quote the encyclopedia, in an article written about early New Persian by a third Göttingen companion, who probably was also Professor Mackenzie's favorite student, Ludwig Paul. Ludwig Paul specialized on early New Persian, and he specialized on Judeo-Persian as well. He writes, what seems, seen from a historical bird's eye view, to constitute a decisive linguistic break was actually a slow and steady development of over 200 years, betraying many moments of continuity. The linguistic difference between the 7th century Middle Persian and the 10th century early New Persian, and I would say even Ferdowsi's New Persian, is certainly smaller in many ways than the one between 10th century early New Persian and 21st century modern New Persian. The distinction between Middle and New Persian is due as much to convention, to extra-linguistic factors such as the historical break mentioned, and to changes connected to this break, such as the shift of script from Pahlavi to Arabic, as to linguistic difference. So, summing up, I have tried to show that during the Sasanian period, Middle Persian spread out from its original motherland in Fars to become the language of daily communication in the entire empire, or at least in the entire inner areas of the empire. This was not due to one class or social group alone, it was not due to the army and so on, rather to the combined efforts of several actors, the main among which are the dibir, the bureaucracy, the clergy, and the military. This process was synergetic. The army brought with itself bureaucrats and clergymen. Some clergymen were also bureaucrats, and so on. And my son, who studies political sciences, would tell me that, well, that's obvious for anyone studying a government system. By the end of the Sasanian period, Persian was spoken and written in most of the areas where it is spoken and written today, at least in inner Iran. Khorasan, Afghanistan, southern Uzbekistan is another story that depends on what happened during the Islamic period. The Pahlavi alphabet continued to be used to write Persian after the fall of the Sasanian, and it carried with it identitarian pride, both religion, as is clearly shown in Quilon. Zoroastrians and Christians wrote in Pahlavi because that was the language of their religion, And this is striking. Of course, we're not talking of Christianity on the whole, but of Syriac, of a specific Syriac Christianity. And ethnic. In Lajim, in Resgate, in Radekan, it was the language of the Persian aristocracy and of the Persian aristocrats that may have hosted Ferdowsi when he left Ghazna, or when he left Mahmud of Ghazna, to be more precise. In the 9th and in the 10th century, a nationalistic movement, was it Shubia, whatever Shubia was, I don't want to enter this question, which is for literary historians, first of all, adopted pre-Islamic heritage as a fundamental part of Iranian identity. And again, when I say Iranian, I mean non-Arab. A lot of Turkish dynasty took up Iranian identity as their own identity against the Arabs. And finally, the use of the Pahlavi alphabet died out, and this is a bit more questionable, because it had somehow fulfilled its task. And the Shahnameh, Khwadai Namak, national history tradition, revived Iranian identity in a new Islamic ecumene. Being Italian and having read Croce, I tend to say it was because of Ferdowsi. 1 week ago, I met Mahmoud Omid Salar, who told me, look, you think Ferdowsi, which is not 100% correct, you should think Shahnameh, but intending the Shahnameh as a meta text, as not only the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi, but the Abu Mansuri Shahnameh and the Shahnamehs that were written before in national history and so on. Again, it's difficult. It's a difficult issue to call one way or the other. But anyhow, the existence of this normative text, or maybe of this normative tradition, allowed Persian to be what it is and established a specific variety of Persian as the literary language, which in its turn became the language of the Persian ecumene in the Islamic world. Of course, once again, it became Islamic. It was not against Islam, but it was an Islam that was extremely different in all its traditions. Thank you.